From the far end, somebody whose CV is very much still a work in progress. Malcolm Turnbull, of course, former Leader of the Opposition and now Shadow Minister for Communications. Next to him, George Megalogenis, who's a senior journalist and political commentator with The Australian and an Insiders regular. He's the author of Fault Lines, The Longest Decade, the quarterly essay Trivial Pursuit, and most recently The Australian Moment. Lachlan Harris, thank you. Lachlan Harris was Kevin Rudd's senior press secretary throughout his prime ministership. He's a commentator still in politics and the media, a columnist for the Sunday Telegraph, and among other things, he's still trying to keep the banks honest, which is very commendable. And Annabel Crabb, well, where do you start? The ABC's chief online political writer. She's a columnist. She's a regular on all sorts of television programs, you name it, including Insiders. And Peter Hartcher is both political and international editor for the Sydney Morning Herald. He has won journalist's top award, the Gold Walkley, and he's won a business award for business reporting. He's written 3 books: Bubble Man, To the Bitter End, and the latest is The Sweet Spot. Please welcome Peter. So what I thought I'd do, I'll invite each of the panellists to just give a couple of brief comments off the top about the topic, and then we'll get rolling on a whole bunch of issues that I think we ought to cover. So we'll start with you, Peter.
On the question of whether the political culture is dead.
Yeah, that's the tough one, yes.
Well, in the immortal words of Monty Python and the Blue Norwegian Parrot, I think it's not dead, just resting. My view on the story so far is that what we have is not so much a breaking of the political culture as of leadership. In my view, is that Australia's real luck isn't the mining boom, it's the fact that we had a couple of decades of really first-rate political leadership in this country. And like a lot of our national successes, it was a bipartisan success. We had and, you know, we didn't appreciate every moment of this as we lived it on the way through, but Hawke Keating, followed by Howard Costello, were leaders who took on difficult and unpopular reform tasks, not because they had to, but because they thought it was important. And the 2010 election, to me, was a watershed because it was the first time that neither political party was proposing any ambitious reform. In fact, it was characterised by the speed with which the parties were jettisoning ambitious political reform. And I think the Australian public responded to that abrogation of leadership by voting, as many people have remarked, neither of the above at the 2010 election. So not a break of the political culture, but I think a culture of leadership and failure on the part of both parties. And are we responsible? Well, I don't want to go on at too much length, but I actually think that despite all our faults, and there are many, and there aren't many accusations you can make about the Australian media that I don't think are actually pretty well based, at the end of all that, I think the Australian public is smart enough to see through all of our nonsense, all of our tricks and faults and flaws, I think the Australian public responds to the big and important developments.
Annabel.
So we're crap, but people ignore us.
Yes,
that is reassuring. Look, politics is a really scrappy, hostile place at the moment, not just among practitioners and those who report on it, but people who kind of, unlike our usual story in Australia, where we elect governments and then we kind of set and forget for a few terms. No one can quite disengage from what's going on at the moment because it's all a bit crazy. But there's a constant argument going on about whose fault it is that this is all so crap. And politicians think it's the fault of the media because we don't report what they do or say properly. And, we think it's the fault of politicians who don't show enough leadership or strength or pander too much to our quirks and oddities without, kicking us to the curb every now and again. I think what's happened in the last sort of probably 10 years, certainly 5, is actually a communications revolution that is little short of an industrial revolution in the way that we cover everything, including politics. And it's had profound implications for the way everybody works together at all levels, it used to be that the political media in Australia was a limited number of outlets, publishing, maybe once a day. Content was planned and disgorged to a largely passive audience, at regular intervals. What's happened in the recent, quite short period is you have this incredible deregulation of that entire system. Now you have not daily deadlines, but hourly or minutely. You have all sorts of outlets, not just the ones that with which we've been familiar for years. Journalists respond to that rather stupidly. We're so bad at, planning and, you never see a big group of journalists on an away day or, having a work retreat to strategise about, it's just, plough through every day. And we're kind of trying to keep doing that even though the entire world has changed around us, right? And what the new regime means is that you're madly producing content all the time, I remember even when I got to Canberra, you could occasionally have lunch, that never, ever happens, except perhaps for you, Peter, I don't know. But, oh, takes one to know one, just because you stopped eating, Malcolm.
We banned lunch in the Rudd office.
Anyway, so there we are, pumping out this stuff. And when you change deadlines like that, it really does change the way news works, because a story that might have lasted all day in the old system now lasts 2 hours, and then everyone's looking around for something new. And politicians experience life differently as a result. There's so many more outlets, there are so many more backbenchers on TV the whole time, you see a whole lot more of politicians, but you hear them saying less. Why? Because when they're called upon to provide content the whole time, the only way they can protect themselves from going mad is to just sort of talk pap. It's that kind of, when you watch a whole interview and at the end of it you think, did I just have a micro sleep or was there just nothing going on there? And, this is the great curse of the modern politician. We call upon them all the time to provide content, for us, so that we can fill our news channels and our websites and all of that. And they have to come up with stuff, but stuff that doesn't really get them into trouble or, so they end up with this reconstituted language that's like luncheon meat, they just squirt out 10 minutes of, nothing and then go on their merry way. And I can see why that's frustrating sometimes as a consumer of media. You watch and you think, well, what was the point of that? So I think we're all coming to terms with how to operate this new circumstance. And apportioning blame is kind of, fun, but kind of in the end ridiculous, because it's not going to change. It's not going to go back to the way it was. You have to find a new way of dealing with it, or not allowing yourself to be done down by this system's extremes. I'm hoping that some of the other panellists will have some ideas about how to do that.
And Lachlan.
Well, I was
I gather you
obviously
didn't stop for any meals.
Yeah, in charge of creating the lunch meet down in Canberra for a couple of years, so thanks for that. No, look, the first thing I'd say is don't panic. We're all going to be pretty harsh on politics tonight, and it deserves to be harsh because politics really sucks at the moment. But politics is cyclical. It will correct eventually. At the moment, the kind of era of super high discipline, low risk politics will come to an end, and there's probably a guy on stage that is going to play a bit of a role in that, I'd say, in the future. Don't tell him I said that.
I'm not running.
And so
You're the next
politics will
Minister
change
of
in the
Greece.
future. And it's not going to change because politicians are getting nicer or smarter. It's because in the end, voters, it's just not working anymore. The old system's not working anymore. If voters wanted Hare Krishnas, there'd be a rush on orange robes in Canberra, you know what I mean? They're going to want more authenticity, more ideas, and so that will come. It's going to be ugly getting there, but it will come. Second point is, I really agree with Annabel that the whole idea of sort of apportioning blame between the two parties is a bit like a sort of a river and a cliff arguing over who caused a waterfall. You know what I mean? Like it's a ridiculous argument. Good politics really needs journalism, and journalism actually filters out the worst part of politics. And politicians self-censor themselves as a result when they know they're going to talk to you through journalists. And so it's an incredibly important process. The problem is not too much journalism, it's too little journalism. And it's not that you guys aren't doing great journalism, it's just that journalism itself, real news-based, fact-based journalism is disappearing for most people. And where they're getting their news is from opinion, whether it's radio or panel shows, all that extruded meat that you talked about. It's actually not news at all. It's opinion, and it relies on a division, an argument to keep on cycling. And so that is a very, very frightening phenomenon which is coming on. And I always joke that I think we should start an international kiss and news-based journalist day. If you meet someone who is genuinely a news-based journalist who is writing a story about objectively about what are the facts, where are my sources, what are the two sides of this argument, those people are so rare and they're so important. And if you meet one, just, you'll be able to spot them because they'll either be old or very poor, unfortunately, at the moment. And so I guess my final point would be, what's really being subversive these days is not signing a petition or sending an email to a politician. It's paying for fact-based news, actual news, not a column, not a panel, none of that stuff. Real news, basically. That's being subversive these days, paying for that, ingesting it, reading it, and then voting for politicians who actually believe in ideas. So if that happens, it'll improve. It's going to take a while, but we'll get there in the end.
George.
Very good. So we're talking about two businesses. The respective sides thought they understood politics. I'll put politics to one side. I'll talk about media for a moment. The last 10 years or so, we all agree there's been a disruptive technology that's hit us and it's taken our reader away. It's taken our revenue stream away and it's taken our reader away. So we've lost our base. And when media loses their base, they start to do strange things. We know in the 90s when talkback radio started to intrude into political debate, some of the journalists put the cap locks on and started to type as if they were shouting, to meet the challenge of Alan Jones and to meet the challenge of Ray Hadley. When the internet came, of course, not only was the cap locks on, but you were filing every hour, every half hour to try and just, throw as many lines out there as possible to see if one of them would resonate. Now, this is a structural issue in terms of technology, but it's also a challenge to media to reinvent itself. And we probably haven't done a good job up until this point. But it begins with a disruptive technology that takes away the guarantee of revenue for newspapers and for current affairs television and for the nightly news and for radio and for long-form journalism and for books. And it also takes away your audience because the two are related, although the advertising stream and the audience tend to do different things. And so we've got a disruptive technology. Politics in this period, when they first confronted the technology, and Tony Blair has said this a couple of times, he thought, the internet, fantastic, we don't need the media anymore, we could just go direct to the punter. And Barack Obama has demonstrated a facet of that, first decent internet-based election campaign in 2008 got the vote out on behalf of the Democrats for a whole lot of minority groupings in the American electorate that tend not to turn up, except he was able to make them turn up. So the thing does have a bit of power for politics. But what politics has found, now that the media learnt that this thing works to our advantage if we just yell back at them, we continue to carry on like shock jocks and they're terrorised. What has actually terrorised the politician after the introduction of this disruptive technology is the realisation that their base has also disappeared. The main parties used to be able to rely, up until I think the 80s and the early 90s, 40% Labor, 40% Coalition with 20% swingers. If you know 40% of the population are going to turn up each day that you go to work, it makes it a lot easier to hone your message for the 20 who are either paying attention or not. But whatever it is, you're earthed. And you're talking the country up, you're not talking it down. When those numbers switch, as they have for media, we know the media has behaved in quite a fractious way in the last few years. Politicians have done something similar. They're afraid of the electorate, and afraid of the electorate in the way that incentivises the journalist in the most bizarre way possible. If I know a politician's scared, I can't respect them. And if they go to the electorate and ask, what shouldn't I do to offend you, I definitely don't respect that leader. And this is where the relationship after the disruption of new technology and the sort of loss of base support for both our business and theirs, comes this other thing that we realise that neither of us know what we're doing at the moment.
Well, thank you. I think Peter and Annabel have put together a joint defence of the media, and it goes like this. It says to the politicians, if you stop talking luncheon meat, we'll stop writing crap. And there's probably some merit in that. I think it's shared responsibility. I want to pick up on what George and Lachlan have said in particular. There are a number of very, very big changes in the media political landscape that can't be avoided and can't be ignored, and they're all connected. So I'll just start off with the first thing. The first thing is that the digital age, the internet age, has absolutely shattered the business model of newspapers. Now, in the business of journalism and the business of news, newspapers were the biggest and most important foundations. The vast bulk of the news gathering, the analysis was done by newspapers. They had the resources to do it. The only part of the electronic media that came even close to that was the ABC. And that's why I've said in this new world, the ABC is more important than ever, because it is a surviving bastion, because it's publicly funded. It's just great to see that Alan Jones got so many of his listeners here tonight. I knew he's always talking me up on the show. So what's happened to the newspaper business is that they're actually not losing readers, George. I beg to differ with you there. The readers of the Sydney Morning Herald or the Age or indeed the Telegraph or the Australian are actually more than ever, but they're increasingly in the digital domain. And what's happened to newspapers is because the functionality, the efficiency of the digital world is so much greater than the print world, they're losing millions and millions of dollars of advertising revenue to the digital world and indeed to other operators, Google being the best example. And insofar as the newspapers are maintaining a digital presence, they are effectively, as the Americans say, exchanging print dollars for digital dimes. So that is why, Fairfax is a good example. It's a company I've had long association with in different guises over the years. Plaintiff, acquirer, shareholder, writer, done everything except be the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald. And but the interesting thing about Fairfax, it's a terrible story, really. This was a company that was taken public out of bankruptcy in early 1992, and I was very involved in that whole exercise, some of you will remember. We floated the shares at $1.20, and they went up to $1.40 on the opening. The stock is now 64 cents. That's 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. The stock is halved in value. It's a colossal destruction of wealth, and this is not a reflection on the journalists or even the management. It's happening all around the world. So what that means is, Lachlan, there are less resources available for journalism. And of course, as you've said many times, and you're dead right, commentary and opinion is cheap. It's much easier and cheaper to pay someone to sit at home and knock out a sulphurous column than actually have a team of journalists doing some work and some research and analysis. So that's the first problem that you've got. That leads into this problem of a 24 commentary cycle, not a news cycle, that Lachlan Harris has talked about a lot, and I agree with him. It's a very good analysis. The other thing that I think we should be very concerned about in the media is, and I don't have any easy solutions to this, or indeed any hard ones particularly, is the dissipation of it. And I'll illustrate this by reference to America. Everyone is appalled. Anyone who has any affection for the United States, including most Americans, are appalled by the polarisation, the utter dysfunctionality of Washington nowadays. And when I talk to American senators and congressmen and say, what's causing this? They say it's the change in the media. They say to me, years ago, you had Walter Cronkite on the evening news who gave a balanced, reasonable account of the day's affairs, and his counterparts on other networks. Now, if you want to believe Barack Obama was born in Kenya, is a secret Muslim and, in league with the devil, you turn on Fox News. If you want to believe the Republicans are, the equivalent of that, you turn on MSNBC. And of course, that's probably a bit of an exaggeration in terms of cable news, but it is not an exaggeration in terms of the blogosphere. And so what you're seeing is we are no longer having the same common experience where we're all essentially watching, or not all of us, but most of us, are watching the same general account of the day's affairs. And in other words, people are listening to the outlets that agree with their particular point of view. So you get a fracturing of the body politic and a rush to the edges and the extremes. And I think that is a very problematic issue in a democracy, because at the end of the day, what journalists do is just as important as what I do as an elected legislator. And that journalism is under threat for all of those factors. And again, I know clearly I got a good round of applause for this earlier. It's a good crowd for the ABC tonight. But it underlines the importance of public broadcasting, because it is a big, chunky foundation of news and commentary and analysis that, because it is publicly funded, is relatively immune to this. And you've got to ask yourself this question, and I'll close with this. I've talked for too long. It's advice of politicians. There is no one in the industry that could honestly put their hands on their heart and say the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age will be around in 10 years' time. No one would say that. Some people would say they'll be around in 5 years' time, but they would question whether they'd still be print publications. Now, I hazard a guess that there will always be a digital equivalent of the Herald and the Age. But if its revenue base is so narrow that it cannot employ the journalists to do the work, what has that done? What diminution has that been to the quality of our democracy? And that is the big issue in the convergence story. We've got in the convergence debate, everyone seems to be talking about the wrong issue. The big issue is what is happening to journalism. And that's what I'd like to. Not tonight necessarily, talk about whatever you like. But I don't
think we're going to talk about anything at this stage.
That's the issue that troubles me.
Well, we will too. Thank you. Interesting comment on Fox News in America. I'm just wondering where you go in Australia if you want to hear Julia Gillard described as the devil, but we won't put that on you at this stage.
No, there've been suggestions about her engaging in sort of ocean racing without the benefit of a boat.
Yeah.
And that was Mr. Jones, I think, suggested that.
Yeah.
But don't you think, on Fox News, that's a business model. That is a business model for grabbing eyeballs. I'm not defending it, but this is, when you ask the question, Malcolm, how do communications companies maintain revenue in a fracturing audience? Well, the way they do it is by appealing to people's political views, make them feel like they're part of a community. And I think that what you have instead of this general, more neutral public meeting place of the evening news that everybody watches, the Cronkites or whatever, you get more of this sort of political meeting place where everybody has the same views as you. So people always look at Fox and think it's, a kind of a political operative from Murdoch and Roger Ailes and so on. I think Roger Ailes is just a man who's spotted the business opportunities of political stratification very early and made a... I'm not arguing with you either.
Totally agree with you.
Do we think the electorate's changed, by the way, apart from the base vote, which we might discuss later?
This is a really interesting point. First of all, this evening on the way here, I heard an excellent metaphor from one of my daughters about this sort of balkanisation, this fracturing of the media audiences into different bits, and you now only need to listen to what you already agree with. My 18-year-old daughter was on her way to something I'd never heard of before, a silent disco. And I said, "What's a silent disco?" And she said, "You each wear a pair of wireless headsets and dance to the music that you choose."
Wow.
So you're in a room, in a hall, dancing...
Sounds like question time.
Yeah, there you go. No interjections.
Wow.
So you're in a room dancing to your own beat, everyone's out of rhythm and out of sync, but you're perfectly happy because you're hearing what you want to hear. Now, the good news, though, I think, we spend a lot of time looking at the US and comparing ourselves to the US, and it's often a very instructive thing to do. But on this question, I think it's really important to emphasise one of the structural differences, in fact, two structural differences, which mean that Australia, in my view, will not get quite as polarised a media landscape as the US has got. And I'll be brief, but there are the two structural factors. One is the US has voluntary voting, we have compulsory voting.
Correct.
As long as you have voluntary voting, the premium for a political party is to turn the vote out, to get people off their bums to go and vote. And since they do it on a Tuesday, have elections on a Tuesday, and employers don't actually encourage people to go out and vote, it's a struggle. So in Australia, of course, because we have compulsory voting, the parties pitch to the centre. Elections are decided at the centre. That's why we have so many earnest debates about mortgages and interest rates. In the US, they're pitching to the extremes to get turnout. That's why, even though they're in the worst economic situation they've had in decades, the Republican candidates have just spent the last 6 months arguing half the time about abortion. They go to extremes, our system drives to the centre. And the second structural difference, I think, is that in Australia, there's a lot more contestability of seats because electoral boundaries, seats are created by a panel of bureaucrats, an independent panel. In the US, boundaries are drawn up for the House of Representatives by the state legislatures. Now, if the state legislature is dominated by a Democratic government, then they will favour the Democrats in the way that they do the boundaries. The contest is increasingly polarised. In the last House of Representatives election, there were only about 30 seats in the US that were genuinely contestable. So again, our system drives to the centre and the US to the periphery. Their media has followed those structural differences, and I think it's one of the reasons our media has not and will not go that far.
Now, Lachlan, when Lindsay Tanner left politics, he wrote Sideshow, The Dumbing Down of Democracy. His argument essentially was that the media, political media, is now more about entertainment, and essentially the politicians signed up to that. What do you feel about that?
Look, I think there's no doubt there's been a decline in the quality of news media, but that's just simply because the age of journos is going right down. The amount of time, the amount of resources they have. There's still really good journos doing really good journalism, but the vast majority of journos who you communicate to the media, to voters with, are very, very young and very inexperienced. So I think there's no doubt there's some structural things driving that. But I guess I would respond, you hear a lot of this thing that it's the internet that killed journalism. I don't accept that. I don't want to get all Charlton Heston on you, but I think it was what the internet told us about what readers want that killed journalism, unfortunately.
Yeah.
The reality is, when you go to the smh.com, news.com, any of those sites, they're not ideological. They are putting up what readers want to click on. You know what I mean? It's maths. It's not an art form. And so we've got to be really careful about assuming that this is kind of a conspiracy of misunderstanding rather than a deep understanding. And that's much more frightening when you think about it, is that what's happening is readers are getting what they want, not what they don't want. And that's the same with voters in a little bit. So we've got to be really brutally honest about that. The second thing I'd say to Peter, I'm not so confident about your analysis that we won't go as hard in Australia to the kind of extremes. It has nothing to do with the reality of our political situation. It's a little bit towards Annabel's point, is I think a business model which is evolving in the media is effectively create a sense of crisis and then make your watching of my television show or your purchase of my newspaper an act of defending yourself against that crisis. And so that's what I think, and you see that a lot, I think, it's evolving now in the the media in Australia is this kind of things are so bad, the boats are coming, everything's in crisis. The only thing you can do to save yourself is buy this newspaper, basically. And that has nothing to do with the kind of the structural element of the of the democracy. And that's why I think, unfortunately, until readers and viewers and listeners and all of us change what we pay for, then you are going to get a push right to the edge, and it could get very, very ugly here in Australia.
Malcolm, do you think politicians have signed up to this dumbing down? You look at a lot of the panel programs now, and ex-politicians are a bit like ex-footballers now. They want to be part of it. They sign up to these panels. They queue up to be on them.
So limelight deprivation disorder.
Exactly, and that's a fairly new thing.
Oh, I'm not so sure about that. I agree with Annabel that there's more. This panel's too aggressive. I'm going to violently disagree with Lachlan that next, but I'll agree with Annabel that there are so many more outlets. There are so many more shows, and because of pay television and the internet and all of the stuff, the multi-channels, the digital multi-channels for the free-to-air. So I think there's just a lot more demand for people to be on air. But can I just profoundly disagree with you, Lachlan? You're right in the sense of saying that the newspapers are, delivering people what they want to read, and of course, everyone tries to do that in the media business. But you cannot ignore the fact that their business model has collapsed. I mean, there used to be a time when people talked about the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age as classifieds as the rivers of gold. Rupert Murdoch used to describe them as the rivers of gold. Those rivers have stopped flowing. They've all gone to the online world. I mean, who now would look for a car or a house or a budgerigar ploughing through pages of classifieds, on a Saturday morning? Inconceivable. Nobody does that anymore. And so what's happened is...
Doesn't that just tell you that no one ever really wanted to read the news? They were really buying it to buy the car or the budgerigar?
No, people were prepared to book the ad.
But Lachlan, look, we can be as flip as we like. This is a really profound problem. The business that has paid for most of the business model that has paid for most of the journalism, for not just the great commentators like Peter Hartcher and George Megalogenis and Annabel, Barrie, but about all of the thousands of journalists that have been out there, standing in the back of town halls, listening to speeches, digging around and finding out, which local council has been doing the wrong thing with DAs. All of that has to be paid for. And the business model that paid for it is evaporating. And I'm telling you, you cannot replace that with tweets and Facebooks and blogs. That's the problem. This is a profound threat to our democracy. Sorry to be serious, but it is.
Can I think you're completely right about the business model, but the business model that we're talking about is effectively a bundling one. That's what it used to be, right? In the Sydney Morning Herald, you'd have bundled information. You'd have the classifieds, and if people were looking for the classifieds, they'd buy the whole paper, right? People who were chess freaks buy it for the chess column or the, crosswords, or people who were interested in economic news, or people who were interested in sporting news. And because we had very little feedback, really, we all just assumed that they were buying it to read our bits and pieces. I'm sure they're buying the paper to read my column about
but
X,
Annabel,
Y, Z.
can I say...
I've got to finish.
All right.
So, then what's happened in the interim is a massive unbundling. You can pick and choose now online, and we find out all of a sudden what people were actually reading all along, because you can track now on any story who's reading it, who isn't, where the traffic is. And to our utter horror, we find that, it's, Britney
Kim
Spears
Kardashian
shaving her head or whatever, and maybe not so much the
budget
thing that we were so,
Although the budget...
interested
by the
in.
way,
Sorry, George.
The budget is still the number one circulating edition of most people's papers, apart from grand finals. Now, Barrie, just quickly. See, I assume that the electorate was ever thus, but this disruptive technology has shown us what it really is like. And that the thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, I think people are terrified. In the media, they're terrified that people weren't paying attention. And in politics, people are terrified that there is that much disinterest at one level and that much anger at another level. So we had a sense of stability which reinforced itself, in old media, and it allowed politicians to be a little braver, and it allowed journalists to be a little more earnest. Now, of course, if you went into any pub, or if you sat at a dinner party or a Christmas or a Christmas lunch, the place was going nuts. But you didn't know that, and in fact, it was okay that you didn't know that because there was nothing to tell you. Now, we've found out what the place is really like, what the country's really like, and it is terrifying people. Now, at some point, of course, this thing will reset because we'll learn to put the filter back up and ignore every conversation that's going on in Australia at the same time and start to focus on the stuff that might matter. The business of government, the business of journalism are different things to the business of everyday argument in a pub or at a Christmas lunch. Now, I mentioned earlier about what had happened to the base votes. And I'll give you a number out of Greece, which is very interesting. Now, the Greeks do have a compulsory voting system, except they don't fine you if you don't bother to vote. Like they won't tax you.
They don't fine you if you don't bother to pay tax.
Yeah, so there's a bit of that there. But so everyone roughly saw this thing called the GFC in the last quarter of 2008. Lehman Brothers goes under. Finance basically stops for 3 months, or manufacturing stops for 3 months. The world is about to go off a cliff. That's the end of 2008. The Greeks had an election in the second half of 2009, and we had one in August of 2010. Now, it turned out that they're two main parties that have been sharing government since this phase of democracy, which started for them only in 1974. The centre-right and the centre-left party, between them, had just under 80% of the primary vote in 2009, just after the GFC. In Australia, it was a bit over 80%, it was 81.5%. These are the two main parties, so this is the stability model, this is the old status quo. The election the other week, the reason why the Greeks are about to bring down Europe is that the two main parties' combined primary vote is, remember, 32% between the two of them. Yeah. The governing party finished third. Yeah. 68% voted none of the above. Now, in Australia, we saw that. We saw that in a way when we hung the Parliament.
Yeah, but George, isn't that why politicians now feel...
They're terrified.
Yeah, terrified. Yeah. Put it that way. They're more vulnerable because it was only 3 years ago or so that Kevin Rudd was 60-40. Yep. Now it's 60-40 the other way around, which tells you that the 40% of the electorate
is
unaligned, right?
So John Howard had been saying, and he sort of picked this thing just at the end of that sort of big restructure in the 80s, going into the early 90s recession, end of the Cold War, a few things starting to line up at once, and that 40-40-20 became 30-30-40. Now, what happens with 30-30-40? We've seen it once in New South Wales when the coalition reduced to a primary vote about 33% in 2003. We saw it in Queensland in 2001 when the Liberal and National Party vote was below 30%. It was about 26-27. So everybody's sweating what happened to Labor here. And in Queensland, I think this is historic, this is unprecedented. No, this is the wrecking ball of the pendulum getting Labor this time, but it did get the Conservatives 10 years ago. And Kevin Rudd was in a position just 2 years ago, when we were still sweating the polls, Annabel and I don't talk polls anymore, but we do remember in the dim dark past he was at 60-40.
But fundamentally it's a cop-out, blaming journos. Politicians blaming journos for their bad behaviour is a cop-out, but I think journos used to make politicians behave better, and then you've kind of stopped doing that quite as well as you used to, basically, because there's just not as many of you. And so it's like my mum makes me a better person, but when I act badly, I'm not allowed to blame my mum. And that's kind of the relationship between journos and politicians.
I know your mum. That's very well.
Peter, how in those circumstances, talk about reform. I mean, how can a political party pursue difficult reform when they are so vulnerable now to an electorate?
Well, after Kevin Rudd deferred Labor's emissions trading scheme, his support took a very severe beating. He was vulnerable, was toppled, and the conclusion that was widely reached in Labor was, you shouldn't attempt an ambitious reform like that because it's too difficult, you'll get hammered, and logic would suggest to you that in a hung parliament it's got even harder and even worse. Two thoughts. One is, after Rudd was brought down, I thought, well, is that the end of the reform era in Australia? Does this mean that following Howard's failure to bring off work choices, Rudd's failure to bring off the ETS, the collapse of both of their governments, that no one else will attempt ambitious reform? So I rang up your former employer, Bob Hawke, and I rang up John Howard, and I said, what do you fellas think? And they both had essentially the same answer, which I thought was very interesting. Different words, exactly the same sentiment. Both of them said, of course not. What we did in our own time was extremely controversial. Reform is possible, but you have to take the public with you. The second thought I'd offer is that, specifically on this hung Parliament, I think it is inherently more difficult when you don't command a majority, absolutely, to get reform through. However, I would point out that after stopping and starting again, Labor under Gillard is actually implementing, we're just a few weeks away from the beginning of a carbon tax, which majority governments were not able or willing to implement. So the answer is more complex than I think the superficialities suggest.
Barrie, can I pitch your job for a split second and ask Malcolm Turnbull here, who was at the other end of those conversations in 2009, when you almost landed the bipartisan deal for a emissions trading scheme. That's a bit of a sliding door moment in Australian politics. Can I get you to imagine what would have happened if that thing got up at the end of 2009? Would we be having this debate at all about the end of the reform era?
Well, no, I think what would have happened was if it had been passed, you obviously wouldn't have had a carbon tax, so you would have had an emissions trading scheme, so the carbon price would not be $23, it would be, less than half of that probably. So obviously I'm a notorious supporter of market-based mechanisms for cutting emissions, but as indeed many people in the Liberal Party have been over the years, but I've never supported a fixed price. I've never supported a carbon tax for precisely this reason, because you set the price and then the economic circumstances change and you suddenly discover the price that in very good conscience and well-informedly you set there really is too high, or it might be too low, of course, more likely to be too high. So you wouldn't have that problem. And what, my view was at the time, obviously my colleagues or just over half of them didn't agree with me, but at the time I thought we should get that issue done and settled, and then focus on the fundamental issues of economic management. I had a very strong view then. I think many people's eyes have proved me right in this respect. I think that Labor overspent in the GFC. I think they panicked and spent way too much, and I think that caused a host of problems subsequently. So my view was that get the ETS out of the way and fight the election on economic management. Now, you've only got to look at, to be fair to Tony Abbott, you've only got to look at his polls to see that the approach that he took has proved to be very successful. So, you can't, as John Howard always says, politics is governed by the iron rules of arithmetic, although if that was the case, Kevin Rudd would be leader of the Labor Party now. So there's a proviso, unless all of your colleagues hate you so much they're prepared to commit mass suicide rather than have you back.
Although,
it reminds me of another party.
He was planning to execute every one of them.
When you asked about the capacity of the system to generate reform, I always think about what the most important skill that a political leader has, right? And that is the skill. And it's kind of got a bit denatured in in the years of the terms of trade boom, when it's become easier for politicians to actually buy their way out of trouble rather than employ the traditional skills of leadership, which boil down to your ability as a leader to convince a majority of people to accept hardship now in order to produce a future good or future well-being for yourself or your children or whatever. That is the core of politics and political leadership, I think. And I think in order to convince people that you're rigid, you've got to be prepared as a political leader to put yourself in harm's way as well. And I think that when you have political leaders that want people to submit to a hardship in the short term for a future interest, but then freeze at the thought of electoral peril themselves, then it's not a very convincing equation. And I think there's only a few politicians in Australia that are currently identified as kind of making that sacrifice. I think this chap's one of them, incidentally, which probably explains his continued, although we shan't mention it because we don't want to embarrass you, Malcolm, popularity in polls. Not that I, of course, read them. And in a funny way, you know, even though Julia Gillard, I think, continues to be tarred with the brush of being, you know, poll reactive and poll obsessed. I mean, she, having got off to a rather cluttered and unusual start, is introducing a reform that is probably going to kill her politically. So, you know, that is something that a leader needs to do, I think.
Before we get to questions and we run out of time, I do want to raise an issue which I think is fundamental to the way that we operate, journalists and politicians, and that's the rules of engagement. The rules of engagement that exist according to background briefings and the use of sources. Now, Michael Gowenda, who's a former editor at The Age, said that the way it operates at the moment, he says, encourages dishonesty from politicians and timidity from journalists. And that's because, basically, the sources are protected. They can lie to you, they can say something, they can contradict what they tell you in public, but still they're protected. Their sources are protected. George, are you happy, satisfied with the way that the system works in terms of the use of sources?
Well, I know how I work it, which is if somebody does lie to me or mislead me or is pretending that they know more than they actually do, I don't use them again. But that's just personal taste, and that's experience over a number of years. And I do have the excuse of being a policy-focused journalist, so I don't have to worry about a bit of the day-to-day politics. But if you're in the day-to-day political reporting role, you know, the big political correspondence role in Canberra, and you're on the phone every day to both sides of politics and people are lying to you 90% of the time, at some point someone in our business is going to have a brain snap and just say, and line them all up. But I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. But there are some very interesting issues, and the Kevin Rudd matter is an interesting issue because Julia Gillard did try to bait the gallery to free them of any obligation they may have felt to her to protect her. Remember that point at the press conference?
What she said is that if anybody here can say that I've ever criticised Kevin Rudd, then I free you of the obligation. Yeah. Speak up.
So no one spoke up, but the point of that is, and if any of you have heard anything that Kevin said about me, you're obliged to tell me now. That's essentially what she was doing, because I'm looking for some sort of basis and fact to sack him. Wasn't that the point? But I think
it was after it. After it resigned.
But a lot of the sources that were quoted in the lead up to the last challenge that flushed Kevin Rudd out prematurely, of course, with sources telling people that the numbers were better than they were, and the sources must have known this, but they played along with this because they knew it would have its own momentum. They were a party to the game, were they not? Malcolm?
Oh, absolutely. I think there's far too much uncritical reporting of anonymous sources, and I've experienced the consequences of that, as we all do. And it is, journalists really should be much more discriminating. And some of the most, frustrated conversations I've had with journalists has been when they've written stuff saying, a prominent backbencher says, a leading frontbencher says, a person close to a leading frontbencher's barista's girlfriend, taxi driver, hairdresser says. And
I once got junior sources last night told The Age.
Best
moment of my life.
It really is. It is
shadow sources.
And part of the problem is it's the everybody wants to be Laurie Oakes syndrome. Because you see, with someone like Laurie, who is seen as being very, very experienced, very responsible, very worldly, huge reputation to protect. When Laurie Oakes says a government minister said da-da-da-da, people say, yeah, that government minister probably did say that and was probably a serious person, but then everybody wants to do the same thing. And half the time, I'm not suggesting that journalists make it up, but I think sometimes they do gild the lily a bit. And I think but you see, it's lazy. It's the easiest thing in the world, Barrie. It is so much easier to write that sort of drivel than it is to actually do some work. And I think part of the problem is, getting back to the point I made earlier, I used to say of Australia, too many journalists, not enough news. I think now, in some respects, we don't have enough journalists and as a consequence, they don't have the time to write any news.
I would agree. It's definitely abused. I mean, I've done it myself. I'm sure Malcolm has as well. That's the reality. It's an abused form because we are pursuing internal political debates.
You're free to confess for yourself. But don't,
everyone does it. Every single person in Canberra does it. Dom from Aussies probably does it, for all I know, you know. Like, everyone does it. But I guess Keating has this line about big ideas turning down the noise on the static, and so I don't think it's legitimate for us as politicians or their kind of operatives to whinge about it, because what happens is, when all the big ideas disappear, this little stuff starts to become stories, and journos get desperate, and suddenly what the junior baristas, hairdressers, you know, mechanic said 3 weeks ago matters, you know what I mean, in a leadership debate. So in many ways, we've kind of created this beast by starving journos of real stories and real ideas and real policies. And I've abused it. They should be better, they should be smarter, they should be more discriminating. But in the end, we've created a vacuum, and now they're filling it with what effectively is non-news.
Yeah, by the way, Barrie, there was a time when somebody in a minister's office or a prime minister's office or an opposition leader's office would background you, and the conversation would be along the lines of, here's where we're taking this issue, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, you know, and then you had your private meeting with the prime minister or the opposition leader, this is what I want to do with the country. I haven't had a conversation like that on either side of politics for a number of years.
But that's because all that they're talking about is who's going to be next in the leadership.
This goes back to part of the sourcing is now so banal because they're not telling you anything.
Well, there's nothing to brief on in 18 months. Who the hell knows what anyone's doing in 18 months these days?
Just people used to govern that way.
Just before we go to questions too, we've had a go at the politicians and the journalists, I guess, one way or another. What about the public and the way they think? Just before we throw it over to the public. Peter, and this is for you because this is a strong theme that you've written about in the sweet spot. But extraordinary figures in the Sydney Morning Herald on Wednesday in the business section, which showed the survey on financial security. The Spanish are more financially secure than Australians, and they've got 24% unemployment. They feel more secure. What is going on in this country?
Something pretty odd. You know, there was a story in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago about Americans and their therapists. And this is a big subject, but I'll give you the short version. The headline on the story was something like how to stop a nation of whiners. Stop listening. And the story kicked off with an anecdote about a young woman who was in therapy and talking to her therapist about all her problems of dating men. The young lady in question, I noted, was all of 23 years old. Nonetheless, after a couple of minutes of this, the therapist interrupted her and said, "Haven't we heard this before?" And this was a demonstration of a new style of confrontational therapy. Now, rather than just sitting back and agreeing and nodding sympathetically and taking notes and letting you run up the clock, the hour's done, and come back and let's do it all again next week. Yeah. These are therapists who refuse to listen to your whining and say, "Listen, just toughen up, princess." And now.
I just can't hear the politicians saying that.
I think you've worked out exactly where I'm trying to take this. We should, of course, have political leaders who are capable of telling it like it is, describing our national situation as it is, and telling us how they're going to make a better country. However, the constant pandering that we get about, we know you're doing it tough. We know everything is terrible. I mean, lots of people do have tough lives. I'm not trying to diminish that. There are all sorts of problems, and Australia's got no shortage of problems. But some perspective is what's needed, and perspective is what's missing. And perspective is what you should go and see a therapist for, I guess. Because we get caught up in we fall in love with our own gripes. We've got a national narrative of complaint going on at the moment. Where we tell ourselves everything is terrible and getting worse. But as long as our political leaders refuse to counter that and pander to us by saying, "Oh, this is terrible, cost of living is shocking, everything's terrible and getting worse," on both sides, then they are encouraging, in fact, inviting us to continue complaining about our dating problems. The therapist is in, the therapist is taking notes, and the therapist is nodding sympathetically.
Okay.